Chapter 1. The Garden. Fate at Rosehill. The village of Rosehill lay like a little jewel set amongst the rolling hills of the English countryside. Neatly kept cottages with their rose bushes and hollyhocks faced onto winding lanes. Gardens were clipped, orderly and seasonally bright. It was, to outward appearances, a place of peace. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple was often fond of remarking, wherever there is human nature, there you will find secrets, and sometimes rather nasty ones. It was the day of the annual garden fête, a red-letter event in the village calendar. Held upon the broad lawns of the vicarage, it gathered everyone of importance, or who thought themselves so, and many who merely sought tea, jam, or gossip. The June sun shone obligingly, dappling the tables under striped awnings, while bees hummed over the sweet pea borders. Miss Marple arrived just past 2:00, walking slowly but firmly along the lane with her parasol neatly folded. She was greeted with warm smiles by those who knew her well, and with respectful nods by those who knew only of her, the quiet elderly lady who somehow always seemed to understand people. On the lawn, the scene was animated. Stalls had been set up in the traditional fashion, jams and chutneys at one end, knitted shawls and embroidery at another, and a row of second-hand books and curiosities in between. Children dashed about with shrill laughter, clutching penny buns and paper flags, while the raffle drum sat proudly at the centre, waiting for Mrs. Bantry's inevitable announcements. The vicar's wife presided over the tea urn, flushed but determined, while Dr. Travers had already settled himself with a slice of seed cake, gravely pronouncing it excellent for digestion. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea, rather weak but very hot, and sat upon a folding chair from which she could observe. That was, after all, her quiet delight, watching. She noticed Mrs. Pennington's sharp aside to her daughter-in-law about the uneven scones, Mr. Henry Carstone's lingering glance at young Mrs. Lyndhurst, and the exact, slightly superior tone with which Mrs. Bantry instructed a child in the proper way to fold a raffle ticket. All such things went into Miss Marple's mental storehouse, though to outward eyes she was but a gentle old lady enjoying her tea. The centre of attention, however, was a stall near the entrance, presided over by a tall, spare man with snowy hair and a dignified bearing. This was Mr. Archibald Blenkins, lately retired after 50 years in service as butler at Marleycombe House, the ancestral seat of the Cholmondeley family. To many, Mr. Blenkins was a curiosity, a relic of an older age, with his impeccable manners and discreet silences. To others, he was a figure of fascination, for he was said to have seen things. A butler in a great house, after all, was privy to scenes and conversations that rarely saw the light of day. At the Rose and Crown Inn, over a single half-pint, he had occasionally let drop a phrase or a chuckle that suggested secrets untold. Never more than that, of course. A butler of his standing did not gossip openly, but the possibility lingered tantalizingly that Mr. Blenkins knew more of the Cholmondeley family's tangled affairs than anyone else alive. Today, he stood tall behind his stall of curiosities, brass candlesticks, an old carriage lantern, bundles of faded keys tied with ribbon, and even a silver snuff-box with the Cholmondeley crest faintly engraved. He greeted customers with a dignified bow, his voice deep but precise, his hands steady as they wrapped purchases in brown paper. Villagers pressed close, partly for the bargains and partly for the man himself. It was just past 3:00 when the incident occurred. Mrs. Bantry was bustling toward the raffle drum, her bosom heaving with excitement, and the vicar's wife was refilling the urn for the 3rd time. Children shrieked with delight at the coconut shy. Then, from the corner near the gate, there came a sudden commotion. Miss Marple looked up to see Mr. Blenkins sway. He had set down a glass paperweight upon the table, but his hand seemed to slip. It rolled off the stall and landed softly on the grass. His eyes widened, startled, and he clutched the edge of the table with a gasp. Several ladies exclaimed.
Someone cried, "He's fainting!"
But before anyone could reach him, Mr. Blenkins crumpled. His tall figure collapsed awkwardly, his head striking the edge of the table before he fell to the ground. The brass candlesticks rattled. A bundle of keys slid across the stall. For a moment there was stunned silence, then voices rose in alarm.
"Fetch the doctor! Quickly, the doctor!"
Dr. Travers was already pushing his way through the crowd, dropping his plate of seed cake upon the grass. He knelt, placed firm fingers against Mr. Blenkins's throat, then bent low to listen. His face, when he straightened, was grave. "I fear," he said heavily, "that Mr. Blenkins is quite beyond help." There was a collective gasp. Ladies pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, and children stared wide-eyed. The fete, so lively a moment before, seemed suddenly hushed, the bright sun mocking in its cheer. "Heart failure, no doubt," murmured the vicar,
though his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, yet at his age,"
Mrs. Bantry said breathlessly, though she too looked shaken. Miss Marple, quietly setting aside her teacup, moved a little closer. She noted, with the unobtrusive eye that had long served her, two small details. First, the expression upon Mr. Blenkins's face, not merely slack in death, but pinched, almost surprised, as though struck by pain or shock. Second, a small paper cup that lay overturned beside the stall. A dark residue clung to its inside, and a faint, unusual odour rose from it, quite distinct from the usual tang of tea. The body was carried reverently into the vicarage drawing-room to await the coroner. The fate stumbled on in a subdued fashion. The raffle was drawn half-heartedly, the stalls abandoned early. By 6 o'clock the lawns were empty, save for trampled grass and the faint flutter of bunting in the breeze. That evening the lanes of Rose Hill buzzed with rumour. At the Rose and Crown voices overlapped in speculation. He was old, you know, 75 if he was a day. Still, he looked hearty enough this morning. They say he muttered something just before he fell. Something about a confession. Nonsense. That'll be someone's invention. In her neat little cottage on the lane to Willowbrook, Miss Marple listened as Alice, her maid, breathlessly repeated the latest gossip while clearing away the supper tray. Miss Marple merely smiled, her needles clicking softly as she knitted. "Funny though, isn't it, Ma'am?" Alice said, lowering her voice as though the walls might hear.
"They do say he had secrets. And what if someone didn't want them told?"
Miss Marple glanced at her knitting, then out of the window where the roses nodded in the twilight. "Human nature, Alice," she said gently, "is very much the same everywhere.
A sudden death, and people cannot resist a little embroidery."
Still," she paused, her voice soft but thoughtful, "sometimes within the embroidery one finds a plain truth, waiting to be seen." Chapter 2. Whisperings in the Village. The following morning dawned bright and clear, as though determined to belie the unease that hung over Rose Hill. The roses in Miss Marple's front garden opened wide to the sun, and sparrows chattered busily in the hedges. Yet the village itself seemed subdued, voices lowered and glances exchanged with significance. At the post office, Mrs. Pritchard leaned across the counter to whisper confidentially to Mrs. Larkin that she had heard from her cousin's niece, who had been at the fete, that Mr. Blenkins had been about to confess something dreadful when death took him. By the time Mrs. Larkin repeated the story at the baker's, it had become a certainty. He had gasped out the words, confession, truth, Marleycombe, before falling. By 11 o'clock the rumour had reached Mrs. Bantry, who declared with considerable authority that she had heard no such thing, though she added with relish that she was sure there were plenty of things worth confessing at Marleycombe House if one were so inclined. At her cottage, Miss Marple received a visit from Mrs. Bantry herself, flushed from her errands and full of excitement. She sat down without waiting to be asked, fanning herself with her hat. "My dear Jane, such a to-do. One can't so much as step out without someone accosting you for your opinion. Poor Blenkins, I always said he looked too thin for his height. Still, you'd have thought a man of his sort would last forever.
Such dignity.
And the way he looked at people as if he knew all about them. Most disconcerting. I dare say it was his heart, though Travers seemed a little doubtful. And then there's this nonsense about confessions, Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, her needles clicking. One must remember, she said gently, how fond people are of adding their own stitches to the fabric. It is quite natural after a shock. Still, one can't help wondering, Mrs. Bantry continued, leaning forward with relish. You know what they say, where there's smoke, there's fire.
And it is rather odd, isn't it, that the poor man should die so suddenly in full view of the whole village?
Miss Marple glanced down at her knitting. Yes, it is rather odd. By early afternoon the police had made their presence felt. Inspector Graves, a solid, careful man with a square jaw and a deliberate manner, arrived from the county town. He was accompanied by a sergeant who took notes diligently while the inspector spoke in slow, measured tones to those who had been present at the fete. Miss Marple, walking up to the vicarage to return a shawl accidentally left on a chair, encountered the inspector just as he emerged from the drawing-room where Mr. Blenkins's body had been laid the previous day. He touched his hat politely. "Good afternoon, madam."
Inspector Graves.
"You were present yesterday, I believe?"
"Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly.
"I was sitting not far from Mr. Blenkins's stall." The inspector regarded her shrewdly. "Then you may have noticed something that escaped others."
"Folk often do without realizing." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly.
"People are apt to notice what interests them most, Inspector. Some will remember the colour of a lady's dress, others a remark about seed cake. I thought it odd, for example, that Mr. Blenkins's expression was not one of peacefulness. It seemed to me he was in pain and surprised." The inspector made a note. "You're quite sure of that?" "As sure as one can be. And I also observed a paper cup overturned near the stall. It had some residue in it, dark, and with a curious odour." Inspector Graves raised his brows. "Indeed, that is of considerable interest. The doctor tells me the man may not have died of natural causes, though he awaits the coroner's report."
"Poison, perhaps."
"Did you see anyone give him a drink?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, I did not. But people were coming and going constantly. It would not have been difficult." The inspector frowned thoughtfully. "That is the trouble with fêtes. Too many hands, too many mouths, too many stories." By evening, the village had found its first suspect. Ned Booker, a surly handyman often employed for odd jobs, had been seen the day before speaking in low, heated tones to Mr. Blenkins near the gate. Mrs. Price, who kept the sweet shop, swore she had seen it with her own eyes. He looked angry.
"He did," she told anyone who would listen.
Leaning in close, shaking his fist. And Blenkins looked mighty stern. If you ask me, there was bad blood there. Ned Booker was known to be rough in his ways, sometimes short of money, and often found in his cups at the Rose and Crown. It was easy enough for the villagers to imagine he had quarrelled with the butler, and perhaps slipped something into a drink in revenge. The theory grew wings. By the time Miss Marple heard it from Alice, it had become established fact. They say Mr. Booker gave him a glass of cordial. Strong stuff.
"Like he sometimes has. And that's what did it," Alice said breathlessly. Miss Marple,
Seated by her window with her knitting, raised her brows. "Do they indeed? That is very interesting. And yet," she added softly, "it seems rather too simple, doesn't it?"
Alice blinked.
"Too simple, ma'am?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Life is rarely so obliging as to present the truth in such a neat fashion."
"No, Alice. When things appear too plain, one must always look a little closer." The next morning, Inspector Graves questioned Ned Booker at length.
The man protested his innocence with sullen defiance. He admitted speaking with Mr. Blenkins about unpaid wages for work done at Marleycombe House, but denied any further involvement. "I've no call to poison the old fellow," he growled.
"All I wanted was my due."
"That's God's truth." The inspector regarded him doubtfully. Motive, opportunity, and temperament all seemed to align too neatly. The sergeant whispered that the villagers would be reassured by an arrest, but Miss Marple, hearing of the matter later from the vicar's wife, shook her head. "Mr. Booker may be rough," she said quietly, "but he is not subtle, and poison, Inspector, is rarely the weapon of the impulsive. It is, if I may say so, the weapon of the calculating." The inspector gave her a long look. He had heard of Miss Marple's reputation. "You may be right, madam," he said slowly. "But we must work with the evidence we have." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, evidence is most important, yet one must also attend to character. In the end, people act according to their nature, and that can tell us more than any number of appearances." That evening, as the summer light faded, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting in her lap, and thought quietly of Mr. Blenkins, a dignified man, a lifetime in service, suddenly struck down in the midst of the village fete. A man who, some said, had secrets, and she thought too of the faint odour in that paper cup. She had encountered it once before, many years ago, in quite a different setting. The memory stirred, elusive, then settled back into her mind. "It will come to me," she murmured softly, "and when it does, perhaps we shall see what lies beneath all this embroidery." Outside, the village lay peaceful in the twilight. Yet beneath the calm, shadows were lengthening. Chapter 3. The inspector arrives. Inspector Graves was not a man easily hurried. He moved with the deliberate care of one who knew that mistakes were made, most often in haste. His square face, ruddy from years of outdoor work, rarely betrayed emotion, though his eyes, a steady grey, missed little. By the third day after Mr. Blenkins's collapse, Graves had made Rosehill his headquarters, lodging in the spare room at the vicarage and establishing himself firmly as the figure of authority. The villagers, while outwardly respectful, were secretly delighted. An official investigation lent drama to their gossip and a touch of the extraordinary to their otherwise quiet days. The inspector began with interviews, methodical and patient. He listened, took notes, and asked the same question twice in different words, a technique which often revealed more than direct accusation. The first suspect, his first serious interview, was with Ned Booker. The handyman arrived at the vicarage in sullen defiance, cap in hand, boots muddy, his jaws set. "You've no call to keep badgering me," he muttered. "I told you plain. I spoke with the old man about what he owed me, and that's all." Inspector Graves regarded him evenly. "You admit, then, there was a quarrel?" "A few sharp words, nothing more. He always was high and mighty, like he still thought himself at the big house." Booker's eyes darted about, avoiding the inspector's. "But I wouldn't harm him."
"Poison? That's women's work, that is." The inspector raised a brow. "Poison, Mr. Booker." "No one said anything about poison," Booker froze, then scowled.
"Well, that's what people are saying, isn't it? Whole village has got its nose in the air. Might as well hang me already." Graves made a careful note. Words spoken in anger, perhaps, but revealing nonetheless. He dismissed Booker with a warning to remain in the village. From her seat in the corner, ostensibly arranging flowers for the drawing-room, Miss Marple observed without comment. She noted, however, the way Booker's hands trembled slightly, not with guilt, she thought, but with fear. Fear of being wrongly accused, perhaps, the family connection later that day. Inspector Graves walked up the long drive to Marleycombe House. The great residence of the Chumley family loomed grey and dignified, its ivy-clad facade exuding history and wealth. Though the upkeep had clearly slipped in recent years, shutters needed paint, and weeds sprouted between the flagstones. Lady Caroline Chumley received him in the drawing-room, a tall, elegant woman with sharp features and eyes that assessed one like a falcon. She wore mourning black, though her relation to the deceased butler was purely professional. "It is most inconvenient, Inspector," she said crisply, "to have such a business connected with Marleycombe. Blenkins was a loyal servant, of course, and his death most distressing, but I trust you will make it clear this was an unfortunate natural event. I shall make clear only what the evidence warrants. My lady, Graves replied with measured courtesy. Did Mr. Blenkins ever speak of his health? Never. He was the very picture of vitality. Stubbornly so, in fact. He refused retirement for years. When at last he stepped down, I thought it a relief. For him and for us.
A butler of his generation can be
particular. Did he ever threaten to disclose private family matters? The inspector asked bluntly. Lady Caroline's eyes flashed. Certainly not. He was the soul of discretion. The very suggestion is an insult, yet as she spoke, her fingers twisted the pearls at her throat. A small gesture, but not lost on the inspector nor on Miss Marple, who had accompanied him under the pretext of delivering embroidery for Lady Caroline's charity bazaar. Odd hints, that evening, in the snug of the Rose and Crown, the talk was all of Marleycombe. Villagers spoke of the Chumleys' dwindling fortune, of quarrels over inheritance, and of Mr. Blenkins's supposed knowledge of a dreadful secret. Each teller embellished the story, until by nightfall it included everything from hidden marriages to illegitimate children and missing wills. Miss Marple, sipping barley water in her corner, listened with quiet amusement. She knew too well how gossip worked. Like ivy, it clung to any surface and spread in every direction. Yet sometimes, just sometimes, a small truth hid at its root. The inspector joined her after making his rounds. "You've heard the rumours, no doubt," he said dryly. "I have indeed," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking. "And one must always pay them some attention, not for their accuracy, of course, but for what they reveal of human imagination. People embroider only on cloth they already recognize, Inspector. One asks oneself, why this particular pattern?" Graves gave her a thoughtful look. "You believe the butler knew something about the family?" "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, "that people seldom invent entirely from nothing. A little seed must exist, or the vine would never grow. A glimmer of truth." The next day, Dr. Travers called at Miss Marple's cottage. He was a man fond of medical detail, and his face was grave. "The coroner's report, Miss Marple," he said quietly.
It seems Blenkins did not die of natural causes.
His heart stopped, yes, but under the influence of digitalis, in a dosage far too large to be accidental. Miss Marple's knitting stilled. "Digitalis," she repeated. "How very curious. For that plant grows in many an English garden, does it not? Quite within reach of anyone with knowledge, or none at all." "Precisely," Travers agreed. "Anyone might have had access. But the manner of administration, in a drink most likely, shows intent." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. "And we must ask ourselves, Doctor, who placed the cup within his reach? And perhaps more importantly, who benefited from his silence?" A wrong turn. Inspector Graves, armed with this new evidence, moved swiftly. His sergeant reminded him of the paper cup Miss Marple had noticed at the fete. A discreet inquiry revealed that Ned Booker had purchased a cordial from the refreshment stall shortly before Blenkins collapsed. The case, to official eyes, seemed clear. A quarrel, a motive, a poisoned drink. The inspector, cautious though he was, felt the weight of expectation from both villagers and superiors. He prepared to bring Booker formally into custody, but Miss Marple, upon hearing the development, merely shook her head. "It does not fit," she said quietly to herself. "Poison requires patience, planning, and knowledge. Mr. Booker possesses none of these. He is rough, impulsive, the sort to strike with his fists, not with a teacup." She looked out of her window into the dusk where the first stars trembled. Somewhere among the calm hedgerows and tidy gardens of Rose Hill lay a mind capable of patience, of secrecy, and of the careful,
deadly art of poison, and she, Jane Marple,
meant to find it. Chapter 4. The coroner's verdict had scarcely been made public before Rose Hill was awash in speculation. Digitalis. To most, It was little more than a word, a whisper of something sinister. To others, it was proof positive that wickedness lurked in their midst. Children were hushed when they laughed too loudly in the lanes, and women leaned close over their shopping baskets, lowering their voices so as not to be overheard. Miss Marple, meanwhile, kept her customary calm. She observed, she listened, and she knitted. What she heard was instructive, the ladies at the post office hinting that Lady Caroline must surely know more than she let on, the landlord of the Rose and Crown remarking that Blenkins could have ruined reputations had he a mind to, and Alice, her own maid, swearing she had seen a light burning late in the windows of Marleycombe House the night after the fête. Inspector Graves, though steady, found himself pressed by both public opinion and official expectation. He paced the vicarage study, notes spread across the desk, as he rehearsed the chain of events with his sergeant, a quarrel with Booker,
a cup of drink,
a man dead. Simple enough. But even as he spoke, the inspector's tone lacked conviction. He was not blind to the doubts raised by Miss Marple, nor to his own unease. The following morning, Graves returned to Marleycombe House. Lady Caroline received him with imperious coolness. "I cannot think why this business is being prolonged, Inspector."
A servant's unfortunate end is sad, but hardly reason to upset an entire community. Not merely unfortunate, my lady, Graves replied gravely.
"The coroner has confirmed poison." Her eyes flickered just once, before narrowing.
"Absurd. Blenkins would never. He was too careful. Indeed, too careful to poison himself," Graves said quietly. There was a pause.
Then Lady Caroline lifted her chin. "If you are suggesting that anyone in this house—" "I am suggesting nothing," the inspector interrupted firmly. "I am merely seeking clarity. Tell me, Lady Caroline, was Mr. Blenkins in possession of any knowledge that might have endangered others had it been revealed?" Her pearls clicked softly against one another as she adjusted her necklace. "He was a butler," they observed. "Yes. But speak?"
"Never. He took his duty to the grave." Yet as the inspector left,
he found himself less certain of her words than of the tension that underlay them. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit of her own to Marleycombe. She came ostensibly to admire the gardens, now somewhat neglected. The head gardener, old Tom Briggs, was only too ready to talk.
"Ah, Miss Marple, it bain't what it was."
Blenkins now, he knew every lock and key in the place. Carried a ring of them, he did. Said once, half in jest, there were doors better left unopened. "Gave me a turn, that did, indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Doors better left unopened. How very suggestive." From Briggs she learned that Blenkins had continued to visit Marleycombe even after retirement, coming once a week to see to things. What things precisely, Briggs could not say, but he had seen him more than once disappear into the disused east wing, lantern in hand. That evening, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and considered a poisoned drink at a fête, a butler with access to old, locked rooms, a family unwilling to endure scandal, threads scattered and untidy, yet threads nonetheless. She recalled Blenkins's face as he fell, startled, stricken, as if something had come upon him with cruel swiftness. At twilight, a knock sounded at her door. It was the vicar, looking troubled. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know. There was an intruder seen near Marleycombe last night. The constable gave chase, but the fellow escaped across the fields. Whoever it was, he dropped this." From his pocket he produced a small ring of keys, old, tarnished, and tied with ribbon. Miss Marple took them gently, her eyes sharpening.
"How very curious," she said softly.
How very curious indeed. Chapter 5. The discovery of the keys sent a fresh tremor through the village. At the Rose and Crown, men speculated that the ring must open secret compartments, or even hidden cellars beneath Marleycombe House. The women, less fanciful but no less curious, wondered aloud what a retired butler had been guarding so jealously. Inspector Graves examined the keys with practised care. They were old, their brass worn, their teeth filed by long use. Some were of the ordinary household variety, but others were unmistakably of older make, the kind that might fit doors forgotten for a century. "Where did you say these were found?" he asked the vicar. "Near the east boundary of the estate. The constable swears the man he chased was tall, with a coat flapping in the wind." "Too dark to see his face," Graves frowned. "And the man dropped these in his flight, which means he knew their importance." That evening, Miss Marple called on the inspector at the vicarage. She looked down at the keys on his desk, her eyes bright with thought. "Have you considered, Inspector, that these may not have belonged to the intruder at all? They may have been stolen from Mr. Blenkins himself." Graves pursed his lips. "Possible. But then the question is, stolen for what? Or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "stolen for whom?" The following morning, Graves and his sergeant obtained Lady Caroline's permission to examine the east wing of Marleycombe House. Miss Marple, under the pretext of bringing flowers for the drawing-room, accompanied them. The east wing was a shadowy, unused place. Sheets covered the furniture, dust lay thick on the banisters, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Yet, as they advanced, Miss Marple noticed that some of the dust had been disturbed. "Footprints," she murmured, "and not very old." At the end of a narrow corridor stood a heavy oak door. One of the keys, after some effort, turned in its lock. Inside lay a room that had clearly not been part of the household's daily life. Stacks of old ledgers were piled on tables. Boxes of correspondence tied with string lined the walls. A cabinet stood in the corner, locked. The inspector tried a key from the ring, and the lock yielded. Inside, neatly filed, were bundles of letters and documents. Graves drew one out, scanning it briefly. His brows rose. Financial records, large sums of money, debts, mortgages. "Good Lord, this house is all but bankrupt." Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze lingered on another bundle, a packet of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, addressed in a flowing hand to C.C. The initials, she noted, matched Lady Caroline's that evening. Word spread quickly that the great house was in difficulty. No one knew the details, of course, but speculation ran rampant. By nightfall it was said that Mr. Blenkins had discovered Lady Caroline's darkest secret and had threatened to expose it. Some said it was debts, others whispered of a scandalous affair. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her parlour, knew better than to trust the village grapevine. Still, she reflected, the truth often grew from such roots. She thought of Blenkins, dignified and precise, walking each week into the abandoned East Wing. A man who knew too much and who might, if pressed, reveal it. And she thought, too, of the poisoned cup. Poison was not chosen in haste. It was chosen because it was discreet, difficult to trace, and required no confrontation. Which of the Chumley household, or indeed of Rosehill, possessed both the knowledge and the motive to employ it? Her needles clicked softly in the gathering dusk. Somewhere among those polite smiles and lowered voices, she thought, was a calculating mind, and sooner or later it would betray itself. Chapter 6. The inspector, though a cautious man, was not immune to pressure. The villagers wanted resolution, the coroner's report demanded action, and his superiors expected an arrest. All pointed, at least superficially, toward Ned Booker. On the morning following the discovery of the keys, Booker was brought formally to the station in the market town. The news ran through Rosehill like fire through dry grass. Some shook their heads, muttering that it was just what they had expected. Others declared indignantly that though rough, Booker was no murderer. At the Rose and Crown, tankards were raised to his health, though more than one drinker added sotto voce that if he had done it,
he ought to swing for it. Miss Marple, meanwhile,
went about her day with characteristic serenity. She purchased wool at the haberdasher's, discussed a recipe for damson jam with Mrs. Larkin, and returned home in time for tea. But her thoughts were not on wool nor jam. They were on the precise expression she had seen on Mr. Blenkins's face as he died, and on the faint smell in that cup. Poison, she reflected, was not the weapon of the clumsy. It was the weapon of someone who disliked a scene, someone who preferred to strike invisibly. Booker, for all his faults, was not such a man. That evening, Miss Marple received a call from young Alice, flushed and wide-eyed. "Ma'am, there's been a burglary at Marleycombe. They say someone forced the study window and rifled through Lady Caroline's desk."
Papers everywhere!
Miss Marple laid down her knitting.
Indeed, that is very telling.
When a man is dead and his secrets threatened, those who fear exposure will not rest quietly. The inspector arrived at the scene soon after. The study bore signs of hurried intrusion, drawers pulled open, documents scattered, a candlestick overturned. Yet nothing appeared stolen, save for a packet of letters tied with ribbon, letters Graves had seen only yesterday in the hidden cabinet. Lady Caroline was pale but composed.
"This is insufferable, Inspector."
"To have my home violated after all else. Whoever is responsible must be punished." The inspector inclined his head. "Do you recall what was in those letters, my lady?" She hesitated just a fraction.
"Private family correspondence. Of no consequence to anyone." From her place by the window, Miss Marple quietly took note of the tremor in Lady Caroline's hands. 2 days later, the village received another shock.
Old Tom Briggs, the gardener, was found unconscious near the potting shed, a half-drunk mug of ale beside him. The doctor was summoned and declared it a case of poisoning. Mercifully not fatal, but grave enough. "He'll live," Travers told the inspector grimly. "But someone meant to silence him. There was digitalis in the ale." Graves rubbed his jaw. "So our murderer strikes again." "But why Briggs?" Miss Marple, who had hurried to the scene, answered softly. "Because he knew too much, Inspector. He told me Blenkins carried keys and spoke of doors better left unopened. Perhaps someone feared he had said too much to others as well." The inspector looked at her sharply.
"Then our culprit is no mere opportunist. He is desperate."
"Desperate men, not dull women, make mistakes." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Yes, and it is in those mistakes that truth most often resides." That night, sitting alone by her fire, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to wander. Why had Blenkins kept those keys? Why had he walked the east wing alone, lantern in hand? What secret buried in those dusty rooms had the butler guarded so closely? And why, above all, had he been silenced with poison, a weapon requiring foresight and knowledge? She thought of the family, Lady Caroline, proud and unyielding. Her son, Mr. Henry Chumley, returned recently from abroad, charming yet vague about his affairs. Her daughter, Eleanor, quiet, almost timid, but with eyes that missed little. All, Miss Marple reflected, had cause to fear exposure should Blenkins reveal what he knew, and all had the refinement and opportunity to employ poison. Her needles clicked steadily, as though in time with her thoughts. "Patience," she murmured to herself. "The pattern is forming. Soon enough, the threads will show the design." Chapter 7. The village of Rosehill, usually content with the rhythms of bell-ringing, tea-tables, and Sunday sermons, now buzzed like a disturbed hive. A butler poisoned, a gardener attacked, and rumours of theft at Marleycombe House. It was almost too much for the neat hedgerows and quiet lanes to contain. Yet beneath the flurry of talk, a current of fear ran steady. If poison could be slipped into the drink of dignified Mr. Blenkins and honest Tom Briggs, then whose cup might next conceal death? Miss Marple, in her quiet parlour, listened with composed interest to the gossip Alice brought in daily. Alice was an eager collector of stories, if not always a reliable one. "They're saying Lady Caroline keeps a locked drawer in her bedroom, miss," Alice reported one morning, "and that Blenkins had the only key."
Imagine a servant with such power. Miss Marple smiled faintly.
It would be unusual, yes. But one must be careful, Alice. People often mistake appearance for fact. A butler may carry keys, but whether he holds power depends on what those keys open. Inspector Graves, for his part, had grown more cautious since the second poisoning. He no longer trusted the neat simplicity of Ned Booker's guilt. The evidence, when weighed coldly, was flimsy, a quarrel, a drink, a coincidence. Yet his superiors pressed him for progress. To that end, he summoned Lady Caroline's son, Henry Chumley, to an interview. Henry was in his early 30s,
Handsome in a polished way, with a smile that revealed little.
He had returned from abroad only months before and spoke vaguely of investments in the colonies. "You knew Mr. Blenkins well?" Graves asked. Henry shrugged lightly.
As well as one knows a servant.
He was efficient, if a trifle pompous.
Why do you ask?
There are suggestions he may have known something inconvenient to your family. Henry's smile tightened. "My dear Inspector, every family has its embarrassments. Blenkins may have fancied himself custodian of secrets, but in truth he was a relic, clinging to authority long after it was welcome." "And yet," Graves said evenly, "someone found his silence necessary enough to ensure by poison." Henry's eyes flickered, but his tone remained smooth. "Then I suggest you look to those who brew gossip for a living, Inspector. I am occupied with business and have neither time nor taste for poison." Meanwhile, Eleanor Chumley, Lady Caroline's daughter, presented a striking contrast to her brother. Pale, self-effacing, and perpetually nervous, she avoided conversation when she could. Yet Miss Marple, meeting her in the village lane, noted how sharply Eleanor's eyes darted, missing nothing. "It must be very distressing for you, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "to have such disturbance so near at hand." Eleanor coloured faintly. "Yes, very distressing. Though I cannot say I was surprised. Mr. Blenkins, he always had a way of looking at one, as though he knew exactly what you were thinking." She hesitated. "Sometimes I wondered if he might speak. To Mother, to Henry, about things best forgotten." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "And what sort of things might those be?" But Eleanor, startled by her own frankness, excused herself quickly and walked on, leaving Miss Marple thoughtful. The burglary at Marleycombe proved a turning point. Though Lady Caroline insisted nothing of consequence had been taken, the missing letters were no trivial matter. Inspector Graves pressed her for details, but she remained resolutely silent. It was Miss Marple who uncovered more. Visiting Briggs in his sick bed, she listened to his ramblings. Fever made him loose-tongued, and in half-sleep he muttered of Blenkins creeping into the east wing, muttering about papers to keep safe. When pressed gently, Briggs whispered, "He said once, miss, said they'd ruin her, if ever they came to light. Said he kept 'em to protect the house." "Protect whom?" Miss Marple asked softly. But Briggs only sank back into sleep, leaving her with more questions than answers. That evening, as dusk fell over Rose Hill, the inspector received urgent word. A maid at Marleycombe had discovered a torn fragment of one of the stolen letters near the shrubbery. Graves hurried to the spot, Miss Marple in tow. The scrap of paper bore a single sentence, written in a bold, masculine hand. "And if you do not accede to my request, I shall be compelled to reveal everything to your mother." The signature was missing, but Miss Marple thought the script familiar. She recalled having seen something similar in the parish records, Henry Chumley's signature, neat and emphatic. Graves looked grim. Blackmail, perhaps. Blenkins held these letters. Evidence of some indiscretion. Henry Wright's threatening exposure. The butler's silence would serve him well. Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful.
"Perhaps, Inspector."
"But one must be careful. A fragment can mislead. Sometimes a scrap of truth is more dangerous than a whole lie." The next Sunday at church, the entire village turned out in sombre expectation. Lady Caroline swept in, imperious as ever, her children behind her. Ned Booker, released on lack of evidence, sat glowering at the back. Briggs, pale but recovering, leaned on his stick. The sermon, preached by the vicar, was on the theme of hidden sins brought to light. Many eyes strayed toward the Chumley pew. Afterward, as parishioners spilled into the churchyard, Miss Marple overheard Eleanor speaking in hushed tones to a friend.
I wish it were over. I wish it. Oh, if only he had not kept those dreadful letters.
The words carried just far enough for Miss Marple's keen ears, and she noted, too, the expression on Lady Caroline's face as she turned sharply toward her daughter. An expression not of grief, but of cold warning. That night, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and laid out her thoughts. Motive. Blenkins held secrets of the Chumleys. Method. Digitalis. Requiring knowledge and calm application. Opportunity. Many.
During the fete.
Too many, perhaps. Second attack. Briggs, because he knew of the keys. A desperate act to silence him. Burglary, letters stolen. Suggests more than one person fears exposure. She set down her pen and folded her hands. Somewhere among Lady Caroline's hauteur, Henry's smoothness, and Eleanor's trembling, lay the truth. But one thing she knew with certainty. The killer was not finished yet. Chapter 8. The air of unease that had settled over Rose Hill deepened with each passing day. Though outwardly the village went on, shops opened, post delivered, roses pruned, yet beneath the routine lay a tremor, like a clock running just off beat. People lowered their voices in doorways, glanced over their shoulders at dusk, and spoke of Mr. Blenkins with a respect tinged by dread. Miss Marple alone retained her quiet serenity. She knitted steadily, observed keenly, and said very little. But, in her mind, the threads of the pattern were tightening, drawing inexorably toward a centre. Inspector Graves, though no man to indulge in superstition, admitted to himself that the case troubled him. He had dealt with crimes of passion before, drunken quarrels, jealous spouses, but this was different. Poison was colder. It required thought, preparation, knowledge, and it left him with too many possible culprits, each draped in half-truths. He decided to press harder at Marleycombe House. Lady Caroline, he observed, had grown sharper in manner since the burglary. Her dignity was intact, but beneath it lay nerves, stretched taut. "I am most displeased, Inspector," she said one afternoon, as he stood in her drawing-room. "The presence of police upon my grounds, rumours in the village, it is intolerable. I insist that this matter be concluded swiftly." Graves inclined his head. "I assure you, my lady, I seek only the truth. It would aid me considerably if you would tell me what those stolen letters contained." Her lips tightened. "I have already explained. Private correspondence. Yet sufficient, apparently, to drive someone to burglary, and perhaps to murder." Lady Caroline's eyes flashed. "You exceed yourself, sir." At that moment Eleanor entered, pale and hesitant. Her hands twisted a handkerchief as she glanced from her mother to the inspector.
I thought I heard voices."
"Is all well?" "Perfectly well," Lady Caroline said, her tone clipped. "Return to your music, Eleanor." But Miss Marple, who was present under the pretext of bringing roses from her garden, observed how Eleanor lingered in the doorway, her eyes full of unspoken fear. That evening, Miss Marple was visited by Dr. Travers. He was a conscientious man, but not immune to curiosity, and he sought her counsel more often than he admitted. "It is the neatness of it that disturbs me," he confessed, stirring his tea absently. "Digitalis is not so easily procured. It requires some knowledge of tinctures, of dosage."
"Most people would never think of it."
"Whoever administered it must have known precisely what they were doing." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Doctor, and that narrows our field considerably."
"One must ask, who in this circle possesses such knowledge?" "You, of course."
"Myself, perhaps, through observation." But among the villagers, very few, the doctor frowned. Eleanor Chumley, she assists sometimes at the parish dispensary, doesn't she? Has a turn for herbs and simples. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. And Henry, too, has travelled. One never knows what a man learns abroad. Yet knowledge alone is not enough. There must be motive and character. She sipped her tea. I have always found, Doctor, that people reveal more of themselves in gossip than they intend. That is why I listen very closely indeed. The gossip did not disappoint. At the post office the next morning, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Pritchard declare that Henry Chumley was heavily in debt. Gambling, they say cards and horses abroad. At the baker's, Mrs. Larkin confided that Eleanor had once been courted by a man quite beneath her station, and that Blenkins had disapproved most strongly. At the grocer's, Mr. Price swore that he had seen Lady Caroline receiving letters with foreign stamps which she hid away immediately. Spain, I think it was, he said importantly. Or perhaps Italy. Anyway, not respectable. Miss Marple smiled politely at each tale, but tucked them all away in her memory. Rumours were embroidered, yes, but the pattern often lay beneath the stitching. That afternoon, Inspector Graves made an unexpected discovery. Searching the east wing again, he found beneath a loose floorboard a small vial, half full of dark liquid. The label, faded but legible, read Digitalis Tincture. Well, there we have it, he said grimly to his sergeant. The very weapon itself.
Hidden but not destroyed. Why?
Miss Marple, summoned to view it, studied the vial thoughtfully. Because destruction is final, Inspector. To hide something is to keep it for possible use again, or perhaps to shift suspicion should it be found. On whom, do you suppose? That, Miss Marple said gently, is the question. 2 nights later, the village was shaken once more. Henry Chumley was discovered lying insensible in the library at Marleycombe, a glass beside him. At first the servants shrieked that he was dead, but Travers, hastily summoned, declared it a faint, induced by a heavy draught of spirits laced with some irritant, but not fatal. When Henry revived, he was pale and shaken.
Someone tried to kill me, he muttered hoarsely.
First Blenkins, then Briggs, now me. You must protect us, Inspector. Lady Caroline swept to his side, imperious even in fear. You will find the culprit, Graves, or I shall complain to the highest authority. The inspector looked troubled. A new attack, but was it genuine or staged? Miss Marple, watching quietly, saw the way Henry's eyes flickered when he thought himself unobserved. She wondered. The next day brought further revelations. Briggs, still weak, sent word that he remembered more. When Miss Marple visited, he whispered, I saw Master Henry night before fate, in the east wing, with lantern.
Thought it queer.
Blenkins was there too, arguing quiet-like. Didn't want me to hear. Said something about the letter and ruin. That's what I recall. Miss Marple thanked him kindly and walked home, deep in thought. So Henry had been in the east wing, disputing with Blenkins. The stolen letters, the financial ruin, the threat of exposure, all pointed to him. And now, conveniently, he had nearly been poisoned himself, as though to divert suspicion. Yet Miss Marple's instinct, honed over long years, told her the matter was not so straightforward. Too many hands stirred the pot. Too many shadows played upon the wall. That Sunday evening, as twilight softened the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat by her fire and reviewed her notes. Blenkins, keeper of secrets, dead by poison, Briggs knew of keys and rooms. Attacked, but lived. Henry, debts, letters, quarrels, possible staging. Eleanor, fearful, observant, knowledge of herbs, Lady Caroline. Pride, silence, hidden correspondence, each had something to gain, something to lose, but which had the patience, the calculation, to choose poison. Her needles clicked steadily. The design is nearly complete, she murmured, but one must wait for the final stitch. And as she spoke, the church bell tolled the hour, a solemn note in the gathering dusk. as though marking the approach of revelation. Chapter 9. The storm that had been gathering over Rose Hill broke at last, not in the skies, but within the walls of Marleycombe House. On Tuesday evening, Eleanor was found wandering the garden in tears, clutching a scrap of paper. The maid who discovered her swore she was repeating,
"It's all ruined, it's all ruined." When pressed,
Eleanor refused to explain, but the maid whispered her tale at the post office before the day was out, and by nightfall half the village knew. Inspector Graves, summoned to the house, demanded to see the paper. Lady Caroline tried to intervene, but Eleanor, pale and trembling, surrendered it. It was a letter, clearly written by Blenkins, addressed to Eleanor herself. "My dear Miss Eleanor, it grieves me to remain silent, but the honour of the family demands it.
I must keep the papers safe, even from you.
Should the truth emerge, it would destroy all. Trust me, I act for your good." The inspector looked up sharply. "So Blenkins wrote directly to you. He feared exposure, and spoke of your honour." Eleanor burst into sobs.
He meant well, I know he did.
But Henry hated him for it. They quarrelled. I heard them myself. He said Blenkins had no right to meddle.
I begged him to stop, but Henry... She broke off, covering her face. Henry himself strode in at that moment, his expression cold.
"Really, Eleanor, must you always dramatise? The inspector will take no notice of a hysterical girl." Graves's eyes narrowed. "Your sister claims you quarrelled with Blenkins the night before he died. Do you deny it?" Henry gave a short laugh. "Quarrel? We exchanged words. Blenkins was insufferable, always prying, always interfering. But poison? That is absurd." Miss Marple, who sat quietly near the hearth, observed them both. Eleanor's tears were genuine, but beneath them lay a deeper fear. Henry's defiance was polished, but perhaps too polished, like silver buffed to conceal tarnish. The following morning brought yet another shock. The village smith, polishing hinges near the east gate, discovered a charred pile of papers in the ashes of an old brazier. Inspector Graves examined the remains, fragments of handwriting, the edge of a blue ribbon, a half-burnt seal. "The stolen letters," he said grimly, "destroyed." But Miss Marple bent close and retrieved a single scrap that had escaped the flames. On it were two words, blurred but legible: Inheritance Trust. She slipped it quietly into her reticule. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Lady Caroline. She found her in the morning room, stiff and proud as ever, but with dark shadows beneath her eyes. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "forgive an old woman's curiosity, but Blenkins's death troubles me greatly. You must know more than you have said. Perhaps the burden is too heavy to bear alone." For a moment Lady Caroline's mask faltered. Her hand trembled as she adjusted a vase. Blenkins was loyal, too loyal. He imagined he served us by keeping things hidden. But secrecy breeds danger, Miss Marple. And danger has come? "Hidden things have a way of surfacing," Miss Marple murmured. "One cannot hold them down forever," Lady Caroline turned sharply. "If you know something, speak plainly." But Miss Marple only smiled, her needles clicking softly. "Not yet, my dear. Not quite yet. The truth must be ready before it is revealed." That evening, the Rose and Crown was alive with speculation. Some swore Henry was guilty, others that Eleanor had snapped beneath pressure. A few muttered darkly that Lady Caroline herself had more to lose than anyone. Miss Marple sat quietly in her corner, sipping weak sherry and listening. From the fragments of gossip she wove her tapestry: debts, inheritance, letters, honour. A picture was forming, sharper now, but still incomplete. As she walked home under the moonlit hedgerows, she whispered to herself, "One more stitch, just one, and the pattern will be whole." Chapter 10. The drawing-room at Marleycombe House had seldom seen so full a company. Lady Caroline sat upright in her high-backed chair, proud as a queen upon her throne. Beside her, Eleanor twisted her handkerchief into knots, her pale face set with misery. Henry, arms folded, leaned against the mantelpiece with an air of injured dignity. Inspector Graves stood squarely at the centre, papers in hand, while a small cluster of villagers, Mrs. Bantry, the vicar, Dr. Travers, had been invited as witnesses to the inspector's conclusion, and, unobtrusively in a corner, sat Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly. Graves cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are aware of the unfortunate death of Mr. Archibald Blenkins at the village fête, followed by the poisoning of Tom Briggs and the attempted poisoning of Mr. Henry Chumley. After careful inquiry, I believe I can now name the guilty party." A murmur ran through the room. Eleanor shivered. Henry's lips curved in a faint smile, as though daring the inspector to speak his name. Graves continued. "The evidence, though circumstantial, points strongly toward Henry Chumley. He quarrelled with Blenkins the night before his death. He stood to gain financially if family letters concerning his debts and mismanagement remained concealed, and the vial of digitalis was hidden in a part of the house to which he had access. Furthermore, the staged attempt on his own life suggests a desperate effort to divert suspicion." Lady Caroline drew in her breath sharply. Eleanor gasped. Henry raised his chin.
"This is outrageous."
"Entirely speculative. You cannot prove a word of it." At this point, Miss Marple laid down her knitting.
"Forgive me, Inspector, but I think, if I may, the matter is not quite so simple." Graves looked at her with respect.
"You have something to add, Miss Marple?" Her blue eyes twinkled faintly. "Only a few observations, Inspector. You see, the difficulty with evidence is that it may be true, but not the truth. And sometimes the simplest clue is the one everyone overlooks." All eyes turned toward her. She folded her hands serenely in her lap. "Let us consider first the method. Poison. Digitalis, to be exact. Now, poison is rarely chosen by impulsive men. It is slow, deliberate, requires knowledge. Not the weapon of the hot-tempered Ned Booker, nor of young Henry, who prefers bold strokes to subtle ones.
No, poison is the weapon of one who values secrecy, one who fears scandal above all else." Her gaze rested gently on Lady Caroline.
The older woman stiffened, colour rising in her cheeks. "Next," Miss Marple continued softly, "consider the motive. Blenkins kept letters that spoke of an inheritance trust and matters that could ruin reputations. Who would be most ruined, I wonder, if the truth were revealed? Not Henry, who already bears the marks of debts, not Eleanor, whose indiscretions are mild in comparison, but Lady Caroline, who has built her entire life upon dignity, honour, and the proud standing of her house. To her, disgrace would be worse than death." Lady Caroline's lips trembled.
"This is insufferable. Please, my lady," Miss Marple said gently. "I mean no disrespect."
"But Blenkins had served you for decades. He knew everything. Your husband's mismanagement, your son's debts, your daughter's romantic entanglements. He sought to protect you all in his way. But perhaps he spoke too plainly. Perhaps he threatened to reveal what should never be revealed. And so he had to be silenced." The room held its breath. Henry stared at his mother in shock. Eleanor covered her mouth. Inspector Graves said slowly, "You suggest Lady Caroline herself administered the poison?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, at the fête when she passed Blenkins his refreshment. She was careful, of course, but I was near enough to observe. Her hand lingered just a fraction too long upon the tray, and afterward, when Blenkins collapsed, it was she who first suggested a seizure to draw attention away from the truth." Lady Caroline rose to her feet, trembling.
"I will not endure this calumny."
Miss Marple's voice remained quiet, almost pitying. "And yet, my dear, the pattern is clear. The second attempt, on poor Briggs, was desperation. He had overheard too much about the keys and the papers. To strike at him was reckless, but you hoped it would be taken for coincidence. And when suspicion grew upon Henry, you saw an opportunity to protect the family name further.
You burnt the letters, but one scrap remained with the words inheritance trust. And that was your undoing." Lady Caroline swayed, gripping the back of her chair.
For the first time, her composure cracked.
"I did it for them," she whispered.
"For my children. Blenkins would have ruined us all. The house, the Chumley name, everything would have been destroyed.
I could not allow it, Eleanor burst into tears.
Oh, mother! Henry turned away, his face pale. Inspector Graves stepped forward, his expression grave. My lady, I am bound to place you under arrest. But Miss Marple, rising slowly, laid a hand upon his arm. Gently, Inspector. Lady Caroline is no hardened criminal. She is a woman who has loved her family too much, and too proudly. The law must take its course, but perhaps mercy will play its part also. Lady Caroline sank into her chair, her grandeur gone. It was all for nothing, she murmured. Nothing but shame. The days that followed were heavy with talk. The village hummed with the scandal, how the great lady of Marleycombe had poisoned her butler to keep her secrets safe. Some condemned, some pitied. Eleanor withdrew into silence. Henry departed hastily for London, muttering of business. Marleycombe House grew shuttered and still. At the vicarage garden, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, "Well, I never!"
Who would have thought it? Our own Lady Caroline with poison.
Jane, how ever did you see it? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking. It is the little things, my dear. The length of a pause, the smell of a cup, a hand that trembles only when no one is looking. People reveal themselves constantly, if one only has patience to observe. On a soft summer evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden, watching the swallows wheel above the rooftops. The roses glowed in the last light. The air was calm once more. She thought of Blenkins, loyal, stern, carrying the family's secrets until loyalty cost him his life. She thought of Lady Caroline, proud to the end, undone by that very pride. And she thought of the village, which would gossip and embroider the tale for years to come, until it became as much legend as truth. Miss Marple folded her knitting and rose. Well, she said to herself, it only goes to show. Murder is very rarely about hatred. More often, it is about fear and love in its most dangerous form. And with that, she closed the window against the falling dusk, the mystery at last laid to rest.